My name is Mario Novelli. I'm the Director of the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex and co-PI of the Peer Network. Welcome everyone to week 3 of the Peer Network lecture series, The Political Economy of Education in Times of Conflict, Crisis and Pandemic. This is a GCRF AHRC funded network between the Centre for International Education, the University of Sussex, the University of Cape Town, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, and the University of Ulster, which aims to promote engagement with critical political economy analysis of education in context of conflict and crisis. The lecture series is also supported by UCFIET, the UK Forum on International Education and Training. All lectures are live streamed through YouTube and available afterwards, and will become part of a free open source resource for all those interested in learning and sharing knowledge and practice about the political economy of education. And I encourage all of you to sign up to the CIE YouTube page. Today's session is led by Toni Verger and Clara Fondevilla from the University Autónoma de Barcelona, and is focused on the political economy of education privatization in times of crisis. Before I introduce them, I just wanted to briefly run through a few housekeeping rules and logistics. First of all, please could you all mute yourselves unless you're asking a question in the Q&A. Please, as you listen to the speakers, please ask any questions during the talk through the chat function, and I will collate those and come back later to request for you to ask the questions. They will talk for around 35 to 40 minutes, and we will then have a 7-minute Sussex buzz in small breakout rooms so that you can reflect on the content of the lecture and issues that have been raised. And then we can come back for a plenary question and answer session for the last time, and we'll try to finish promptly at 2:15 p.m. UK time. So I'd just like to introduce the speakers today. Clara Fondevilla is a doctoral researcher at the Department of Sociology at the University Autónoma de Barcelona, with a research focus on the negotiation of the post-2015 global education agenda and the development of associated global learning metrics. Her areas of interest are education markets, education international development, and the global governance of education. And in the past, Clara has participated in a range of research projects, including a systematic review on the political economy of education privatization reforms, and a study on the role of the World Bank in shaping the promotion of teacher reforms, and also research on low-fee private schools in Peru. Dr. Anthony Verger is Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology, also at the University Autónoma de Barcelona. His research focuses on the study of the relationship between global governance institutions and education policy. That is, how education policies are internationally disseminated and enacted in concrete institutional settings, and what effects it has on education quality and equity. In recent years, he has specialized in the study of public-private partnerships and accountability policies in education. With cross-disciplinary training in sociology and education, Dr. Verger publishes in comparative education, education policy, sociology, and development studies journals. He's one of the lead editors of the World Yearbook of Education and the Journal of Education Policy. And currently he coordinates the ERC-funded project ReformEd, Reforming Schools Globally, a multi-scalar analysis of autonomy and accountability policies in the education sector. I should say that I've had a long-standing academic relationship with many colleagues at the University of Autónoma de Barcelona, many really excellent sociologists of education and fantastic doctoral students and master's students. And it's a real pleasure today to welcome Anthony and Clara here, and to thank them for their willingness to be part of what is turning out to be a really fascinating lecture series that is reaching a lot of people around the world, both live and also later many views on YouTube. So I'll now give the floor to Clara and Anthony and stop the sharing of my screen.
Okay, and I start the sharing of my screen. So, yeah, Thank you, first of all, Mario, for the invitation to this lecture series and to the center that you coordinate for hosting us today to me and Clara. We're going to talk about how periods of crisis of a different nature are conducive to educational policy change and to education privatization in particular. So in the next 30 minutes, we are going to first justify theoretically the relevance of this topic and the mechanism of crisis as a moment of policy change. I will also introduce the framework of our research, and then we will present our main results in the form of 3 different illustrative episodes of how different types of crises are conducive to educational reforms that promote, let's say, market approaches to education, education privatization, and so on and so forth. Basically, we will focus on the role of natural disasters, conflict, and post-conflict settings in particular, and economic crisis and the role of, let's say, economic and vulnerability of some countries when it comes to generate an environment that is conducive to this type of educational reforms pro-privatization. And then we will conclude by highlighting some common features and enabling mechanisms between these different episodes. So to start with, I would like to, I will start by presenting these first parts, and then Clara Fondevila will follow, okay? So this area of research has been very well theorized from very different perspectives. So we find here very macro level accounts, such as the disaster capitalism approach of Naomi Klein, who shows very famously and in a media approach sometimes how crisis and the doctrine of shocks are conducive to this or create opportunities for radical both economic but also social reforms. This is a topic that has been also theorized by historical institutionalists. As you probably know, historical institutionalism tends to highlight reproduction and gradual change, but sometimes they identify what they call critical junctures as key moments of radical transformations. And also cultural political economy as a both theoretical and heuristic approach is a very, let's say, useful, at least for us, perspective to understand institutional change. And in this perspective invites us to identify how the moment of variation, together with the moments of selection and retention, understood as evolutionary mechanisms, are key moments of or decisive moments for policy change. And actually, despite most crises or periods of crisis have a material base, both political, economic, natural catastrophes, and so on, it's important to highlight that the reasons or the problems behind these crises and also the solutions to these problems are socially constructed. So here is important to also identify meaning making and semiotic factors as an essential component to understand crises as mechanisms of policy change. So in this particular research or presentation, we are going to focus on how crises are, let's say, conducive to the generation of education privatization or the adoption of market policies in education, what we are going to tell you about comes from a broader research, a systematic literature review that we did together with Clara and our colleague Adrián Zancajo from the University of Glasgow, in which we identified different pathways toward education privatization. These are pathways of a very different nature, as you can see in this table, which go from the most drastic, radical neoliberal reforms in which the role of the state in education is being transformed, education privatization in social democratic states, scaling up privatization as a most moderate and less drastic form of educational privatization, de facto privatization in low-income countries, historical public-private partnerships, and also privatization by way of catastrophes. So these are, as I said, different pathways towards education privatization in nature. And actually, when we talk about the role of crisis in education privatization reforms, we're going to focus mostly on two of these pathways, which are called de facto privatization in low-income countries and privatization by way of catastrophes. Especially the last one, I think is not very present in the literature and actually as a privatization event in many contexts, but we think that it has a lot of qualities that make it very different from the other pathways, reason why we decided to highlight this pathway at the same level of the others. So maybe it's not so quantitatively relevant as is qualitatively relevant. But as you will see, it has its own logics and dynamics. So this literature review, very briefly, comes from more than 200 research pieces that were published between the years 1999 and 2015. So basically, we focused on education privatization at primary and secondary education because we consider that actually the logics and mechanisms of privatization in higher education, Tibet, are also of a different nature. So we focused on what is known sometimes as basic education, and we combined both literature coming from academic databases with gray literature. And mostly the pieces that we reviewed focused on the political economy of education privatization. We know that there is a lot of literature on, okay, what are the effects of education privatization for equity, learning outcomes, but here we wanted to focus on literature that the main objective of this research is to find out what are the drivers behind education privatization reforms and changes. So in a way, the idea of this presentation is to try to capture this relationship between a context of crisis that might be related to questions of economic vulnerability, state fragility, humanitarian emergency, political conflict, and natural catastrophes, and what we call privatization policies that cover different types of policies and reforms, such as voucher schemes, charter schools, subsidies to private schools, and also some forms of endogenous privatization, such as school-based management. Okay, and actually the research that we have done on this topic has a very much comparative approach, and in the discussion we will reflect on what are the common attributes and drivers and enabling mechanisms of this type of crisis-driven reforms. Okay. So say this, I will start with the first episode, and then from there, Clara will take over. So the first episode is what we call education privatization in the wake of natural disasters. And here probably the empirical case study that has been more extensively analyzed is the educational reform, the pro-charter educational reform that followed the Katrina hurricane that that happened in New Orleans in the United States in the year 2005. It was a hurricane that killed 2,000 people, but also displaced many people. And actually, as you will see, the fact that there was an urgency to reconstruct the educational system was seen as an opportunity by many educational policy entrepreneurs to advance a charter school reform. Actually, in Louisiana, before the Katrina happened, there were different attempts to promote market reforms, including a voucher bill that was unsuccessful. But the recovery school district that was created after Katrina contributed to the fragmentation of the educational system, an educational system that was very much monopolized almost by public schools, moved from 112 public schools to 37 public schools, and the number of charter schools increased drastically only in 5 years from 8 to 51. So, as I said, an educational system that was very homogeneous became very fragmented with this type of reorganization. So then we found in the system public schools managed by the local board, public schools managed by state level bodies, and the same with charter schools. So there were more charter schools supervised by the local board and the state level body. So what were the enabling circumstances? So there was the Katrina generated a critical juncture in which the power relations were drastically altered, in the sense that, for instance, key education stakeholders were actually physically displaced, including some teacher union leaders. Because of the urgency of the situation, what was a tradition of community participation in education reform deliberation didn't happen. So the traditional decision-making structures were dismantled and decisions were taken more quickly. And actually, these decisions were taken by taking into account the voices of new players or players that were there, but their influence was not as important as after the Katrina crisis. So, for instance, different think tanks or philanthropic organizations that actually operated at the federal level saw an opportunity in empowering local pro-market education reform movements. We are thinking here about the Heritage Foundation or the Urban Institute that were especially active in this post-Katrina episode. And even Milton Friedman wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal in which literally called for or saw the Katrina as an opportunity to radically reform the system. So these were his own words. So this idea of, okay, Katrina is an opportunity to radically reform the system and to introduce more choice, more charter schools, etc., which is what ended happening. And of course, one of the characteristics of these reforms is that they are very difficult to reverse once the situation or when the state or the city reaches a situation of normality, because you have created a new set of rules, new stakeholders, new economic and educational interest on both the offer and the demand sides. So as I said, the post-Katrina pro-charter school reform is the most well-documented case, but there are other education privatization reforms in the wake of natural disasters that have been also documented. For instance, in Honduras, there was a hurricane, very strong, also affecting all the region of Central America in the year 1998, the Hurricane Mitch, which was an opportunity for the adoption of school-based management reform funded by the World Bank. In Haiti, more recently, there was a very strong earthquake that destroyed literally the school infrastructure. So a network of international donors promoted a reform that consisted on the adoption of a voucher scheme that meant the expansion of private provision that was already very high, the level of private actors in the educational system in Haiti, but after the reform, this change become more drastic. And more recently, there's no a lot of literature yet, but there was a hurricane affecting Puerto Rico, and after the hurricane, there was the adoption of a pro-charter school legislation in a very similar way to what we observed for the case of New Orleans. But as I say, this is a very recent episode. Hurricane Maria is from 2017, and research is still being conducted on the political economy of this particular reform. So, Clara, the floor is yours. Clara, the microphone is muted.
Sorry, let me go again. Thanks, Tony. So just like in the case of natural disasters, the literature also suggests that conflict settings or probably post-conflict settings are also fertile ground for the advancement of market reforms, typically under the pretense or the guise of development aid, reconstruction, or variations thereof. So part of the reason for this is that the situation of vulnerability of these states make them particularly permeable to actors willing to test privatization policies. And in fact, bringing private providers in a context in which the state is perceived as weak or divided by conflict is perceived as a more legitimate course of action than in normal circumstances. So a first case that illustrates very well these dynamics and that has been intensively documented, especially by the work of Brent Edwards, for instance, is the case of El Salvador. El Salvador was immersed in a civil war between 1980 and 1992, and this proved a helpful basis for a system-wide education reform in which a school-based management program known as EDUCO, for its acronym in Spain, featured prominently. So EDUCO is a school-based management program in which groups of parents are made responsible for the management of the school, and for instance, they are required to contract teachers on a one-year contracts and so on. So it introduces very basic market mechanisms in the education system. So what is interesting of the Salvadorian case is that this program, which was agreed as part of a World Bank loan, this World Bank loan was approved in the year 1991, and that is 1 year before the peace agreements of 1992. So let's say that the situation of democratic void make it easier for the advance of such what was a kind of drastic reform. Also, in fact, the role of the World Bank is very relevant in this case because the World Bank, through the conditionalities attached to a series of loans, exerted a particularly power influence in the Salvadorian education policy during the 90s. And also it allowed for the crucial input of two US-supported foundations known as FUSADES and FEPADES for their acronym in Spain. These were conservative and market-oriented think tanks and foundations, respectively. And they pressed or pushed for more radical education reforms. In fact, initially, they suggested to introduce a voucher scheme. However, when the idea was deemed unfeasible, largely as a consequence of the resistance of the teacher union, they finally, along with the World Bank, settled for the Educo scheme, which is interesting. Interestingly enough, it grew out of a community education initiative encouraged by UNICEF and UNESCO. However, what the Educo program did was to redesign the community education program, emphasizing the managerial aspects and de-emphasizing all the emancipatory potential of the program. In any case, this is a good example of the powerful the power of a democratic void as the one created by a situation of civil war or conflict. So other examples beyond the Educo case and are, for instance, the reconstruction of the education system in post-war Iraq. It has been documented by some authors like Kenneth Salman and others that one of particularly US-supported for-profit organization known as Creative Associates International played a key role in redesigning the reconstruction of the education system. And encourage not only decentralization, but also charter schools and a series of reforms modeled on American programs. And a more recent example is the one documented by Francine Menachi and Zina Zakaria regarding the education programs for Syrian refugees. And these authors have drawn attention to the rise of the private sector in this kind of programs and the potential surge of private schools, sometimes fee-paying private schools that could expand at the expenses of public provision in these spaces. So this is a third example of the potential of this kind of conflict settings. So this is a second illustrative episode of the potential of crisis. And then the third one is the case of low-income countries, that is countries affected by a situation of state fragility, which translates not only in a situation of budgetary restrictions, but also limited administrative capacity and so on. So it has been documented that in a series of low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and the south of Asia, there has been a growth, proliferation of low-fee private schools that initially were created by local entrepreneurs. And because this is a spontaneous phenomenon that takes place at the margins of the state, at least initially, this is typically known as grassroots privatization or bottom-up privatization. However, the key idea here is that this is not a phenomenon that occurs in a vacuum, but in fact, this has to do with the role of the state or the absence of a state role. So basically, the success of these locally initiated schools have to do with an unmet educational demand that in turn is a product of the limited capacity of the state to expand the educational offer. So what happens more precisely is that especially after the abolition of school fees, system expanded in a very rapid way and without the necessary administrative and economic support. So some families, in order to avoid what was perceived as overcrowded classrooms and under-supported schools, they turned or developed this preference for private schools. And in fact, the very underinvestment in public schools feeds or reinforces the belief on the superiority of the private sector in terms of quality. So the very emergence of low-fee private schools has to do with a situation of chronic crisis, to put it some way, that creates or encourages this demand for private options. But maybe it's more interesting the fact that the very consolidation and institutionalization of the low-fee private school model, again, has to do with this situation of crisis, which can be instrumentalized or mobilized by external partners to legitimize the low-fee private school option as a policy option. So, Tony, if you can move to the next slide, please. Different authors have documented that recently low private schools have expanded and consolidated, sometimes, for instance, in the form of low-fee private school chains. So what had initially emerged as the product of a local entrepreneurship finally becomes a scaled-up operation. And in other countries, governments have been recommended to include low-fee private schools in public in PPP schemes in order to make sure that everyone has access to these schools regardless of the economic power of the family. And again, these kind of options, which entail basically a consolidation of the low-fee private school model, have been defended on the grounds that it is a way of overcoming the situation of a state fragility, sometimes the tendency of the state or the difficulty of the state to control for corrupt practices at the local level, also as a cost-efficient measure in a context of budgetary restrictions and so on. An example of the key role of these external partners in legitimizing and promoting this option is the case of the World Bank, which in a series of flagship reports, especially during the 2010s, the past decade, they supported this option. And even so, in recent publication, they have moved away and are far less enthusiastic on the potential of low-fee private schools. The key part here is that the financial support to private partners can continue even when the rhetorical support disappears. So we'll see what happens in the near future. The support to the low-fee private school model has also been promoted by some bilateral agencies and with the material support of multinational corporations that have put the initial investments for the creation of low-fee private school chains, for instance. So again, this shared support for the model has been articulated in a series of networks and spaces in which this idea of the potential of the private sector as a way to overcome a situation of a state vulnerability has consolidated. And maybe an illustrative example of this has been the case of Liberia, in which Liberia is one of the poorest countries in Africa. And in addition, it was struck by a 14-year civil war. And more recently, it was severely affected by the Ebola outbreak. So in a situation of very low enrollment figures and also very low literacy figures, the idea of outsourcing a number of public schools to private providers gained attractiveness within government circles. I think there is the next slide. Thanks. So it was in the year 2016 that the Partnership Schools for Liberia project was initiated. It was basically a large-scale PPP in which some private providers get per student subsidies to run their own schools, while the government still paid for the teacher salaries. Again, this situation in which this idea of vulnerability, of extreme hardship was used as a means to legitimize what is a kind of radical or drastic change in the Liberian school landscape. It is again interesting to see that, again, the role of external international foundations has been key. One of a particular research institution in the United States was tasked with the monitoring and evaluation of the program. And more in general, the Liberia space has become a sort of testing ground to discuss the potential and the pros and cons of the charter school model. So that said, we will move to the last section of the presentation. And we will try to identify the main enabling circumstances and mechanisms that make possible this connection between crisis and privatization, and also more general features of this kind of crisis in that privatization. So to start with, we observed that this episode of crisis that we have documented are characterized by a kind of very rapid pace. So it's a sequence of an accelerated change. And this allows for a rapid change, basically because especially in a context of disaster or a time-bound catastrophe, basically we observe the elimination of the regulatory and institutional obstacles that would generally demand a more a deliberative process. Also, it creates a situation of democratic void in which resistance or even opposition is scarce and very heavily penalized, largely as a consequence of this narrative of the need to act rapidly and to reconstruct the system, the general sense of urgency makes it very difficult for the opposition forces to really oppose this kind of policies, because it's seen as an irresponsible move in some ways. So basically this allows to sideline the typical deliberation opportunities that would take place in a normal process of policy change. Also, second feature of this kind of episodes is that there is a sort of reconfiguration of the power field. This is so because there is a marginalization or sidelining of the traditional stakeholders and veto players. Again, this has to do with what I was commenting about the role of opposition, that not only it is heavily penalized if they oppose the change, but in fact, sometimes, as Tony was commenting, are simply displaced or scattered across the country or the region. So it's difficult to organize some sort of organized resistance. And in addition, and as I think most of the episodes have made it clear, this kind of processes make it possible for external actors, for instance, actors operating at a higher level, at a federal level or at a global level. It makes it easier for these kind of agents to provide input and even to determine the outcome of the process of policy change. This is something that in a situation of normality would be more difficult, because again, there are certain obstacles that made it difficult for these external ingerents. But in these situations, it's simply more easier and even perceived as a legitimate option, as a valid one. So basically, these kind of situations create a sort of unscrutinized space favorable to external influence, or that make countries or cities particularly permeable to this kind of influence. So a third relevant mechanism or idea is that it's interesting to know that in all these episodes, there is a very explicit narrative effort to frame the situation of crisis and disaster in terms of opportunity. So as Tony was commenting at the start of the presentation, even if disasters and crises, economic crisis or whatever, have a very physical dimension or a material dimension, they need to be constructed in a way conducive to the advancement of market reforms. And this is why the role of think tanks and the media and policy entrepreneurs and so on is so important, because there is a need to construct this as an opportunity. And we see that metaphors like this idea of silver lining and the golden opportunity, the bright spot, are recurrent themes that appear in most of these episodes. The fourth characteristic is that most of these episodes, even if initially start in a very constrained place, typically they end up having an impact elsewhere. So what they start, for instance, as a local experience, as in the case of the reform in New Orleans, eventually becomes a model that is used in other cities. For instance, in other states of the United States, like Georgia, they have decided to experiment with these recovery districts. And more in general, it has been a way of legitimizing the charter school idea as potentially helpful. Similarly, with the case of the Educo program in El Salvador, it became the model or the blueprint for other school-based management experiences in other places, initially in Central America and finally in other countries. So it is on the basis of Educo that the school-based management became a sort of global best practice as promoted by the World Bank. So basically, the idea here is that even what starts in a context affected by crisis ends up extending elsewhere, what has the potential to eventually extend elsewhere. And closely connected to this, there is in fact a certain logic of irreversibility. So even if initially these kind of drastic reforms are accepted as a quick response, as sometimes as even a temporal response to a situation of disaster, the need to act quickly and so on, they are difficult to reverse over time, because they create this structure of incentives in which many actors have an incentive to retain this policy option. So they tend to endure over time. However, as different episodes have shown, they are not impossible to reverse. And in fact, this is probably something worth exploring more in depth. So there is a scope for resistance probably. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.